Right. So good afternoon once again, everyone. Um, we're gonna be in this afternoon session exploring Karl Polanyi and the work of Karl Polanyi. Under my categorization of how the question on the matters related to labor uh, progress, Karl Polanyi is one of those authors who I believe is very important. All authors, of course, are important, but Polanyi is poignant um, in the sense of his contributions, the originality of his contributions, um, and the very nature of his writing. Polanyi's first or breakthrough work is a text called The Great Transformation, 1944. The Great Transformation, and it's subtitled The Origins of Our Time. Polanyi is an Austro-Hungarian economist, so he is Austrian and Hungarian, and he publishes this text in 1944 called The Great Transformation, coincidentally in the same year as does his colleague, his Austrian colleague, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek publishes in 1944 a very instrumental text called The Road to Serfdom. So once again, as I always make mention of, it is very important for us to, if we are exploring an author, to pay careful attention to the context out of which the author's work emerges. Polanyi writes in 1944, which places him just about the end of World War II within the historical context. Polanyi, from the very outset, is not a traditional economist. He is not a traditional economist in his approach, and he actually starts one of the great methodological debates which exist in social sciences, rather, in contemporary times, and this is known as the substantivist or the substantivist. Substantivist, the substantivist, and the formalist. So the substantivist and the formalist debate. And that's a very interesting debate which occurs today. And it has its roots, firstly, in Polanyi's approach to economics. So Polanyi advances that economics in itself has two meanings. And the first meaning is the meaning which we in traditional or neoclassical economics ascribe to economics, and that is, of course, the notion of rational action and a rational actor making a decision within the context of scarcity, and looking at which choice will obviously be able to optimize his welfare. So that for him is what he views the formalist or the formalist approach of economics being. Economics, however, for Polanyi means something else, and he sees it in a broader sense, something which he terms in his work as being provisioning. And very simply put, this is for Polanyi the way economics is the way that a society meets its material needs. So within that context, it is not simply this, as we would have mentioned earlier when exploring the marginalists, etc., a reductionist, deductivist, or as some scholars put it, an atomistic approach to economics, but rather it's a broad-based, more all-encompassing approach to analysis and analytical work associated with economics. So for Polanyi, this is the reason, partly the reason why he's not seen as a traditional economist in the sense that he utilizes just that that reductionist, deductivist methodological approach in the same vein as inspired by Ricardo, etc., in the early 1800s. However, Polanyi takes a much broader approach. Polanyi approaches economics from an economic historical perspective. He looks at models of sociological history. He actually starts that field, sociological history. He looks at quantitative economic history. He makes contributions, of course, to political economy, political sociology, um, anthropology, very interestingly. Um, so Polanyi is a much broader scholar than simply just economics. And as this course is supposed to guide you along the line of what those alternative paradigms and thinkers essentially um, mean. So he believes in, of course, that economics refers to the way that a society meets its material needs, but more generally, how humans make a living from their social and natural environment. So the reason for this is because Polanyi later advances a very important concept within the context of analyzing capitalism. So he uh, views his views actually inform the deductions that he reach. So the deductions which he reaches. So it's important for you, if you're interested in economics, to have a look at what is called the formalist versus the substantivist debate. I can, of course, make some material available public for that. So that is as regards Polanyi's methodological approach. His work in particular, we're going to just spend some time and go through Polanyi's work because it, of course, is very poignant, and he views the state and the market as developing historically hand in hand. So for him, one has not been separated from the other. He views that the notion of the state and the notion of the market, which refers to the commerce or the commercial activities, they have developed hand in hand historically. And he says prior to the emergence of the notion of a modern state, the extent of the market or the reach of the market was limited to that of international trade. So here he is viewing economics as having two primary types of states, or viewing history as having two primary states. One is being the pre-modern state, and the other is being the modern state. So for him, in the pre-modern state, where market interactions were concerned, in what we know it today, he said that market interactions were limited to the notion of international trade. And this entire structure began to change through what he terms as being the powerful modern state. A powerful modern state is one which he says influenced the emergence of capitalism, or a more efficient form of organizing. And this notion of a great transformation, which he titles his work, is one which refers to the transformation from a pre-modern to a modern state. In that, he says that the conditions were created by the state for the emergence of a competitive capitalist economy. And it is for that reason that Polanyi identifies that the emergence of capitalism is not something which has been natural, it is not something which is coincidental, but rather he sees the historical condition of emergence of capitalism being one that is very deliberate and as a result of the action of state. And it is at that point that we see the emergence of the modern state. For those of you who would have perhaps read the article which I would have written this weekend, as well as you have been following economic history and the work which we have been doing throughout, you'll note that the political construct and the nature of the society and the social structure, in essence, began to change simultaneously with the emergence of capitalism, with the emergence and the spread of capitalism as the mode of production. But importantly for Polanyi, he says that when this modern nation state emerges and when the capitalist form comes to the fore, the basic social order which existed prior to the pre-modern state or prior to the modern state, that social order had to be destroyed. And that social order being destroyed as a result of the transformation in the mode of production is as a result of a particular phenomenon, which he says that economists in contemporary times, or those who follow the formalist school of economics, tend to ignore. And that is the notion that a market does not exist in an ahistoric, independent vacuum that is absent of social consideration. What does he say? He says, therefore, that all markets, and markets, of course, in this sense, being the place where the buyers and sellers interact, all markets are embedded in society. And that point of embeddedness is one which he says, it becomes very important later on, but he says is instrumental in many of the problems and the crises which we see existing in the capitalist economy. So as a result, we see that change occurring, and the notion that the social order had to be disrupted stems from the fact that this mode of production is embedded in the society. And as such, if one tries to change the mode of production or alter the mode of production, you'll find that there will be many issues. He says that if you take a look at history, and he surveys history in a very brief or a succinct form, and he looks at the pre-modern economies and he cites a few examples. He says, if you look at the Incan Empire, if you look at the Indian Empire, Greece, many of the ancient kingdoms in Africa, including Egypt, Babylon, if you look at the great Chinese Empire, those empires which have gone before. He says that this society operated on the principles of reciprocity and redistribution. So those states operated in his view and in his survey of history with those principles. But he says that the role for markets in those economies, those pre-modern economies, were very limited, and they were also very limited in the important context within which markets play today. That is, of course, in settling prices or in setting prices and in allocating the factors of production. As you know, today, markets in the formalist school, or importantly in those who believe in orthodox economics, the market plays the role of being the main instrument or the main mechanism through which factors of production are allocated or through which prices are set. So he says that in those pre-modern economies, and if you take a survey of history according to Polanyi, you'll find that those societies had a very limited role for markets. So this concept becomes very important for us, because if you have markets which are embedded in the society, then if you plan a particular mode of production, and if you superimpose a particular mode of production, as Polanyi says has been done with capitalism, you will find that there is an attempt to disembed the market from the society. There is an attempt to disembed the market from the society. Now, that is an important construct, because what does that mean? It means, therefore, that the transactions which are to take place between between private enterprise, or those supplying, and the consumers, those buying, will not be subject any longer to what the historical and the prevailing social conditions are or dictate. And as such, you will find a particular reaction from the society. So he says that in this attempt to disembed the market from the society, this concept which he refers to as disembeddedness, you'll find that there is a natural, violent social reaction. For Polanyi, he extends this even further because he says, looking at the historical context of it, anytime there is an expansion of the market in a particular direction, whereas the market is becoming more and more expansive into the society, you'll find that there is a violent, there is a reaction by the society, and oftentimes those reactions are naturally violent social reactions, or in some cases they can be violent reactions. So this is a very important point that Polanyi makes, and he calls this this particular phenomenon the double movement. So the double movement that he's referring to is what I would have just said, where as the market begins to expand, so does the society's particular inclination for it to protect itself against the market expansion. And we can see this occurring. When you have an expansion in markets, particularly into areas or dimensions of individuals in societies, into their lives, where they do not believe that the market should be, you'll find the society reacting. Now, in Guyana, of course, we have had one such example in very recent times, and I just want to throw it out there to the class, for the class to answer. What do you, in recent times, where have you seen that? Where have you seen the society reacting to the expansion in the market? Doesn't necessarily have to be violent, but where have you seen that? I'll ask Kezia Bridgewater to answer me for this one.
So you're asking, where do we see people react violently when we see there's an expansion?
I'm asking, where have we seen society reacting, and the Guyanese society in particular, reacting in recent memory, where there has been an attempted expansion in the market?
Well, at the mention of violence, the only thing I can think of right now is the recent riots or protests that they have had.
It doesn't necessarily have to be violent. It's any form of social reaction.
Maybe I can ask one of my classmates.
So in the interest of time, I'll say, if you think about what the parking meter protest was, that is a very good example of a double movement in society. And this is precisely what Polanyi would have been talking about. People did not feel that the market should be expanding into that sphere of their life. And this is a natural social structure. The free availability of parking is something that has been embedded in this society. And as such, if we're going to try to move that, or if we're going to try to alter that in any way, according to Polanyi, you are going to have some sort of reaction socially. And this is what we have seen over time. I mean, if you think about it in a historical context, particularly as regards labor, you'll find this. So as capitalism emerges and as the market begins to expand more and more, and individuals are more subjected to the, the wrath of the market, if you will, or essentially the naked impact of the market, you will find that society reacts. Now, it reacts in a form that it attempts to protect the social fabric and the society, and those, of course, living in the society. If you take, for example, the emergence of unions, the emergence of unions is a very important consideration in this regard, because unions began to emerge as, if you take the survey of history according to Marx, began to emerge as capitalists try to extract more and more surplus value out of the interaction in the capitalist mode of production. So as work days began to be extended, for example, work in a modern factory began to be extended beyond the traditional hours of work, you found that there was a social reaction by persons, and this actually, as I would have detailed in my most previous article, this would have elicited a response from Robert Owen to start the 8-hour workday movement during the 1800s, and this reaction was channeled in a social context through unions. So we see a very important role emerging in the construct of that double movement, or what Polanyi says is that double movement. Now, that is an extraordinarily important concept. Now, Polanyi tries to go through history in terms of looking at an area in the United Kingdom called Speedham lands. So you can see a chapter in his text called the Speedham land case, and he'll go through that in detail. Of course, as I usually do, or as I would mention, we're not dealing here with Polanyi's work in an extensive form, but rather we are dealing with From the Great Transformation, simply chapters, I believe it's 6, 7, 11, and 14. One of them, of course, being the Speedham land case. So we won't be going through everything with Polanyi, but just for a point for you to note. Now, for Polanyi, he begins to probe on the question of what is a commodity. Now, if we think about what a commodity is, in its substantial form, a commodity is something which is produced or the result of a production process which transforms a particular item or brings together a particular set of items to transform it into a final output. So the notion of a commodity in economics generally refers to a process through which a particular item is transformed into another item. And that, as we know, if we are to term it in our traditional economic sense, that would be the point where our raw materials go through a production process to give us a final output. And that, of course, is the input, throughput, output model. Wassily Leontief, the neoclassical economist, makes a contribution in this regard in economics. So it's called the input-output model. So he begins to examine this concept called the commodity. And what is a commodity? He defines, of course, as being one that transforms a particular item from one state to the other. So then he says that the question must therefore be asked as to whether everything that is being sold in the society is a commodity. Remember, as he continues along this definition of a commodity is an item which is transformed from one state of being to the other state of being for the particular purpose of selling to the market. That's a very important point, because if there are no markets existing, then you cannot be producing a commodity. If the production of a particular item is done, or the transformation of a set of raw materials into a final product is done without the intention of placing it on the market, then you cannot say that you have produced a commodity. So the commodity within this context, within the market context, is one where it's being produced for the market. And Polanyi also puts forward a disclaimer. He says that he certainly agrees that the market structure and the market form of organization is one which has brought unheard of material wealth. So for him, throughout his survey of history, he has found that the market form of organization and this mode of production called capitalism that depends so much on this market is one which has brought untold accumulation of wealth. But he says he believes that the narrow focus or this narrow focus of wealth and the accumulation of wealth, he says it's too unidimensional, very narrowly focused, and it does not give us a broad-based understanding of how the society is developing and whether there is the true material improvement of human conditions. So he says that we have to look at what this structure called a commodity is a bit more closely. And in this regard, in 3 chapters, he deals with this very separately. He says, let us take, for example, the first commodity which is sold on the market, or a commodity which is sold on the market. First one that he examines is that of land. That of land. So land for Polanyi, and as is very common, land is subject to the force of the market. Land is subject to what the market dictates, whether the market allocates to this individual and utilizing the price mechanism. But if we think about it, land cannot be regarded as a commodity, because if you are to define the commodity, it firstly has to be one that is produced. Secondly, it has to be one when being produced with the intention of being sold on a market. Nobody has produced land. Nobody has produced land for the market. No one has caused land to be produced for the market with the intention of buying and selling. We have taken it upon ourselves in the modern state to enact the principles of marketism to what we call the commodity land. He says the other one that we have to pay careful attention to in applying this broad parameter of commodity is that of money. Now, when money is produced, money is not being produced as a commodity per se, but the concept of money. Polanyi goes into the history of money in his text, but the concept of money for Polanyi is one which emerges simply as a medium of exchange. And if we think about it, that is what money essentially emerged as, because if we look at the history of economics, we'll find that there, there of course existed the barter system, and as a convenient way of exchanging goods and services, or in particular goods at that time, um, money emerged as the form or the medium of exchange, and as a convenient means for transacting these these notion these interactions, of a convenient way of transacting. So money, he says, has not been produced for the market, but money is treated as if it is a commodity. And we know that from the notion of interest rates, the cost of borrowing, the cost of money, the cost of obtaining it. So we speak about the cost of money, we speak about buying of money, we speak about selling of money. And for him, all of this is being done in a manner where the item is not one that is actually a commodity. And thirdly, and most importantly, for our context, is labor. Now, Polanyi says that when a mother produces, or when a mother bears and rears a child in the child rearing and childbearing process, the mother is not simply producing a commodity for the consumption of the market. This is an individual. This is a person with feelings. The mother is not thinking about how she will be supplying the labor market, and or how the labor market will be supplied by this individual. The mother is viewing the individual as a real person, as somebody with feelings, and as somebody with emotions. And this is where the concept of embeddedness, of course, comes into play, because what the market is benefiting from human labor, is actually coming from society. It is from that social fabric. So that is a very interesting point. When someone is producing children, they're not producing them with the intent for the market, but yet labor is bought and sold in the modern state and in the modern economy as if it is a commodity, and treated subject to the laws of demand and supply within the market economy. Now, that point is extraordinarily important, because for Polanyi, these three are treated as what he terms as being fictitious commodities. Polanyi terms land, labor, and money as being fictitious commodities. And because of this, he says that this is a means to subordinate this is the substance of the society, a means to subordinate the substance of the society or the social fabric to the laws of the market. Now, this begs the question, therefore, within the model or the construct that Polanyi is providing, whether or not there should be a marketplace for these particular types of items, or whether these three fictitious commodities should be subjected to the laws of the market. So if we take, for example, land, should it be subjected to the market? For Polanyi, and he begins to go through them one by one. If we take land, he says if you subject land to the market, because it is not a natural commodity, but it is a fictitious commodity, you will find that it reacts, or trying to commodify land, there is a reaction by the society and by nature to it. So he says the main fact that we are trying to commodify land and put it into the use for market purposes and for the purposes of the market, and subjecting it to the laws of the market. He says that land in itself, or nature, because when he talks about land, he's not just speaking about the plot of land, he's talking about nature. He says that nature itself will react violently. And for Polanyi, this reaction comes in the form of environmental disasters, natural disasters, and also violent bubbles and speculations, great volatility existing in the economy as a result of speculation on land prices. As you know, land is not something which has an input value, and therefore, when it is being traded or sold in a marketplace, it is merely upon the basis of speculation, and it is subject to very unique considerations in its valuation, as opposed to what you find occurring in the trading of natural commodities. The notion of money, he says, if we look at financial crisis in their substance, this is the reason for it. It's because we're subjecting something that is meant for simply distribution and to facilitate freer exchange and to facilitate better interaction between buyers and sellers. It is for that reason that you'll find that tremendous financial crises emerge, because we are trying to commodify something which in essence should not be subjected to the laws of the market. Now, the interesting one, of course, is that of labor. And for Polanyi, he believes that an alternative, more social or more socialistic concern and structure regarding labor should emerge. Because for him, once you begin to subject labor to the laws of the market, and you begin to buy and sell labor and labor power as if it is a commodity, then what you'll have is labor reacting in a very violent way, or in providing some form of resistance as regards the double movement. So the crisis of land is the crisis of the environment. The crisis of money is, for Polanyi, the crisis or the financial crisis that we reach. The crisis of labor is the one that is unfortunate, because that is the one that really hits home to the substance of the society, the individuals who exist in the society. And those instances of the reaction by labor is where it becomes very violent. So what Polanyi offers us is an alternative form of thinking and about it. And in essence, if we want to, I believe, subject these three fictitious commodities, to use Polanyi's terms, to the market, then we should ensure that in each one of these commodities, that there is sufficient protection against naked and open laws, naked and open tendencies of the market. So in particular, this perspective is insightful for labor, because we begin to get an understanding from a historical perspective and from an alternative perspective of viewing commodities, that maybe it is not a case where these items that are being bought and sold were ever supposed to be bought and sold in an unbridled form, as they are being bought and sold under a free market neoliberal type of environment. So it is a very important question for us to probe, and Polanyi, of course, is an insightful author. You know, so I'd want to offer those. We're very brief this afternoon, because I believe that once we cover those main points about Polanyi, we begin to get an idea of what he is thinking about, and the theoretical contributions of him, that are pertinent for labor. So the concept of embeddedness, the concept of disembeddedness, the concept of fictitious commodities, and the concept of double movements, or double movements, those are the concepts, that are very important and pertinent for us. The just one point, before I close. For Polanyi, every time one of these, or these fictitious commodities are being bought, sold, and are being subject even more and more, to the market and to the powers of the market in an unbridled and unfettered form, you will find also a double movement occurring. Whereas, as the market wants to expand in an unbridled form to these particular commodities, or in a general sense, you will find that society reacts, in a particular way. So, with that, I'll bring it to a close. Please ensure that you remember those concepts, the concepts of embeddedness and disembeddedness, fictitious commodities, and double movement. So with that, I'll open for any questions. Any questions?
So I just want, sir, on this idea of fictitious commodities, I mean, is it the instance where these fictitious commodities actually replace what might be considered ideologies that are being peddled?
Further
Like,
on the question a bit, let me just ensure that I have the right understanding.
like, sort of like in the instance of land, land is not necessarily what you're not necessarily buying is land, but more the concept of security.
Mhm. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's an interesting question, because what you are probing at is the reason why land is bought, but rather you can obtain security in another form. You can obtain security, through investing in another, or in another instrument. But for Polanyi, once in any instance, once those particular, things that are not produced with the intention of being on the market, for example, land, labor, and money, um, those are termed as being fictitious commodities, and you will have some sort of reaction. So, yes, your point is taken, but I don't believe, that it is just as a result of ideology.
All right, sir. Well, I'll look back and read. Perhaps I'll get a better understanding of it.
For sure. Any other question?
Good evening, sir, again.
Yeah.
Sir, is that one of the reasons why here in Guyana we always have protests coming on to the time when public servants expect to receive an increase in the minimum wage? Because it's operating by a market mechanism, and labor wishes to receive more, a higher factor payment.
You see, I I I think that this is where his work is a little bit, it goes a little bit awry, because he does not look at public sector workers. Essentially, public sector workers are not subject, to the laws of the market. So, you would traditionally expect, or within the framework which Polanyi provides, you would expect that those persons would be the ones who are most protected. So I don't think that his framework adequately describes what is happening in a developing country, particularly in a public service sense. So I would not apply his framework in that regard. I would more say if we want to see Polanyi being applied, I'd say anytime you try to have an expansion of the market in Guyana, have a look at what the reaction is, or have a look at if there is any reaction. If there is something which was previously offered for free, for example, and it is now subject to the market, there obviously will be some sort of reaction by the society. If there is something where there is a new fee, or there is a new form of the market applying to some different dimension that it perhaps wasn't, then you will also find the market reacting. I don't think that the example of the public servants are particularly they don't fit neatly into the framework provided by Polanyi.
Sir, as you mentioned it, I think I want to believe it's a bit of a better example, but of course, with your guidance, the example as to when I believe, was it electricity that was being subsidized in Linden?
Yes.
When that was removed, how it stormed protests and social reactions, is that a much better
that is a better example, because in that case we have the market expanding. So the government, remember, a state exists. Part of the reason a state exists is to ensure that its citizenry is protected. So the citizenry in that community were protected from the financial fallout of the collapse of the bauxite industry, and trying to have the citizenry more exposed to the market, in spite of the fact that others in this society are exposed to the market. But we see that as a very good example, because in Polanyi's explanation of it, he would say that the market is trying to expand into an area where the social fabric, where that type of living is embedded into the social fabric. And it's not a case that it would not work, but one has to be very cognizant of how you expand the market in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
No problem. Any other questions?
Yes, sir. Would I don't know if this would fall under the market. There was a reaction in the last two cases with the election. The first one, when there was a change of government, we saw there was a major reaction when people started to go out and clean up the environment. And then the last election where there was protest. Now, would that, yes, there is a reaction, but would the actual election itself, or the changing of government or whatever, would that be something that can be considered a change in the market? Or
No.
would it would
No.
okay.
No, that would be considered that is not considered in Polanyi's structure. Polanyi's structure does not try to address that type, but rather how these particular commodities are, these fictitious commodities, and their expansion and the expansion of the market works, and those reactions, not subject to political changes, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? The most important takeaway for us from Polanyi is the fact that anytime we try to really subject, in particular, labor to the market without sufficient social protection, you will find some reaction coming from labor.
Sir,
Yeah.
one more possible example. So at one point in time, Guyana's sugarcane farmers were receiving some amount of protection due to the preferential prices that we were having on our sugar in Europe's market. So ultimately, when that preferential price would have been removed because of the complaints of the European farmers, that would have caused social upheaval. So I think what the European body would have done, they gave us money so as to cushion the negative effects that our farmers would feel. But I still believe it caused some amount of upheaval. Is that a good example?
Yes, that's a good example, because the workers would have been previously protected from the well,
from the international arena, from having to compete
from the international market. But so you do see that reaction by the exposure of the workers to the international market, but it is as a result of them having to deal with what the market would have originally dictated, as opposed to what the artificial protected form is. So yes, it is an example. It does not fit absolutely neatly into what he thinks, or what I my reading of what Polanyi thinks. But it is a case where labor is subjected to more unbridled, unfettered form of the market.
Okay, thanks, sir.
Any other questions?
No, sir.
All right. Well, if no other questions, we'll close here. Please ensure that you peruse the material. The material is there for you. You ensure that you read those chapters, which we would have identified in the course of outline chapter 6, 7, 11, and 14 for Karl Polanyi. You'll find his work to be very interesting. I think that the framework that he provides gives us something different to think about. And of course, looking at alternative perspectives gives us an insight or a better understanding of how we perhaps should be approaching questions of labor, etc. So thank you, folks. We will, of course, coordinate in the group regarding our next class time. So thank you. Have a good night.
All right, thank you, sir. Good night.
You too.